Welcome back, everybody. The subject now is the trial of Anne Hutchinson and the growth of religious freedom, religious tolerance in America. And we like to think, maybe we were taught in high school, that the Puritans came over here because they wanted religious freedom. Some truth to that, but they mainly wanted religious freedom for themselves. They were not exactly the most tolerant people, sort of why they were called Puritans. They had very strong beliefs, especially about religious dogma. And that is how we get to the trial of Anne Hutchinson. Now, this is way back in 1630. It's about 145 years before we even have our revolution, and we're going to have the Declaration of Independence. So during that century, you have the trajectory of the rights that we are going to get in the Declaration of Independence. And it begins this journey with the Puritans coming to America. As I say, it's in the 1630s. John Winthrop leads a band of Puritans and errand into the wilderness as they leave England because as Puritans, as very, very strong believers in the Reformation and the Reformation of the Church of England, they have become persecuted in England, and they want to be able to practice their religion their way. They're led by John Winthrop, who had been fighting against the papists, i.e. the Roman Catholic tendencies of King Charles I, who had taken over in England. And as radical followers of the Reformation, they objected to the way that King Charles I was restoring some of the trappings and dealings of the Roman Catholic Church into the Church of England. And they were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England of all of these trappings and ways of doing things. And they wanted to have a simpler church. And so when they're prosecuted in England, the Puritans start coming over to the United States in order to be able to practice their religion in the way they want. 1,000 of them sail with Governor John Winthrop over to America in 1630. They sail in 11 different ships. And as they're embarking, John Winthrop on the Arabella, he gives a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. And it talks about how America is going to be as if a city on a hill. The eyes of the people are upon us. And it was a beginning of American exceptionalism. And so not only do you have these people coming over here because they want to practice their very strong brand of Puritan Reformation of the Church of England, they also want to come here because they want to set up a shining city on a hill. That leads us to the trial of Anne Hutchinson. She was convicted, as we'll see, of heresy, but her trial and the way she conducted it and what she did helped put America on the path towards greater religious tolerance. And Hutchinson was a strong Puritan, a follower of John Cotton, who was one of the people who came over to preach with Winthrop. John Cotton used to give 7-hour sermons. Women were not allowed to preach, but Anne Hutchinson, a very smart, very passionate woman, was allowed to have meetings in the home in order to discuss the sermons of the day. Her meetings became so popular that soon they were hosting 60 or more people a week. And the great debate among the Puritans then seems somewhat arcane, but it's a very core doctrine in the question of the Reformation and in Protestantism, which is the question of whether salvation can come through good works or whether salvation comes through God's grace alone. It was known as the antinomian crisis, which you don't have to remember because I don't think people really understand what antinomianism means, but that's a label that was put on it. And Anne Hutchinson was firmly on the side of salvation comes through God's grace alone. That there are certain people who have been graced, they're part of the elect, and you cannot earn entry into heaven. You cannot earn salvation through good works or pious lives, other things like that. And so Hutchinson was put on trial because she kept pushing this doctrine of God's grace alone, which the people in authority didn't exactly cotton to. It was not something they really liked because it caused people to skip church services. It caused them to sometimes criticize the ruling elite. And it appealed Anne Hutchinson's salvation through God's grace alone a lot to the merchants and the craftsmen who are more attracted to their professions than their religion. And it all deepened when Anne Hutchinson at one point walked out of a sermon by a minister who was preaching salvation through good works. And she walks out of the sermon. She takes a group of women with her who had been part of the Anne Hutchinson's learning circle and provokes this confrontation. And she's called before the religious leaders of the colony. And in 1637, you get the trial of Anne Hutchinson. As you can see in the picture, you have John Winthrop, you have the governor who are there as part of the trial. Governor Winthrop is both the governor of the state and the chief prosecutor, and he gets to be the judge in this trial. So it's not exactly the best judicial way of doing things, but during the trial, Anne Hutchinson goes toe-to-toe with John Winthrop and is able to debate salvation through God's grace, salvation through good works, and whether or not she has been a heretic. So what happens? She, of course, loses the trial. The very end of the trial, even though she's been doing very well at sort of volleying back and forth with Governor Winthrop, eventually she starts talking and explaining how she can know what she knows and talk about how she talks. And she says it's because God speaks to her directly, and that the Spirit moves her. And that was considered heresy, especially by the ministers of the Puritan churches of the Boston area. And so she gets convicted, and John Winthrop banishes her from the. What happens is that Anne Hutchinson and her husband and other followers decide, because they've been banished or she's been banished from the colony, they're going to go off to Rhode Island, to a plantation in Rhode Island, where they're going to establish a new colony. Now, what they do, and they decide to go to Rhode Island and establish their new colony, is they create what's called the Portsmouth Compact. This is a very important document. And the Portsmouth contract says that they're going to try to found a state where all people might worship God according to the dictates of their conscience, unawed by civil power. They made the 6-day walk down to Plymouth, and then down to Providence, and then down to Providence and Portsmouth, where they could establish this new colony of Rhode Island. And it becomes the first colony that's established with a compact to say there should be religious tolerance people should be able to deviate from the orthodoxy. Eventually, you have that in a lot of colonies, especially Pennsylvania, especially Philadelphia, named the city of brotherly love because it has people from all different religions living there. But what the trial of Anne Hutchinson does is that it gives her a chance to not only address the court in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but to address all of posterity, and in some ways be a symbol of two things: women standing up to power and demanding their rights, and people saying we're better off in a nation that permits religious tolerance. Even though the Puritans had come over for the right to practice their own religion rather than be tolerant of others, after a while, after there's so many schisms within the Puritan factions, some of them, led by Anne Hutchinson, realize that they're all going to be better off if they try to create societies that are based on religious tolerance. In 1663, a full charter is given to Rhode Island to become a new colony, a charter that guarantees the freedom of religion to all persons. And that slowly becomes a standard model in the United States. And we can thank Anne Hutchinson for being willing to stand up and challenge authority, which is a very American trait, for being a woman who was not cowed by men telling her she had no right to her own opinions, and for being a person who realized that if she wanted to practice her religion and believe in the dogmas that she believed in, then she had to be part of a society that allowed all people the tolerance and the respect to practice a religion the way they wanted to. So let's raise a glass and toast Anne Hutchinson. Thank you.